here at City College, and it is our honor and our privilege to welcome you to this forum and discussion this evening on this very, very important topic, the Harlem African Burial Ground. I'm here in two roles, as Dean and also as co-PI with my colleague Jerome Hayford of the Place, Memory, and Culture Incubator here at Spitzer, the Mellon-funded project with which we've engaged with so many of you in this room on community-based preservation efforts here, here in Harlem. Jerome, well, I think we all know Jerome, right? But all of you, but many of you will soon. And so at this point, I'd like to ask Jerome to say a few words of welcome as the person here at Spitzer who is directing so much of our work with regard to the PMCI. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all here. We're really excited to partner and to help uplift this effort and see some new and old faces. Just a couple things about this project. The Place Memory Culture Incubator has been going for about 1.5 years, and it's really this sort of transformative effort in the school and has brought together a number of stakeholders into this ecosystem at Spitzer, including a few of you in the room, who I see. And one of the kind of core curriculums is the studio, and one of the sites that we looked at back in the fall was the burial ground site with a few students who are in the room. And I want to give a shout out to, or a plug for the Generative Histories Harlem exhibition, which some of you saw as you walked into the school. This is a great opportunity, maybe as you're leaving, to take a look all the way around at some of the work that these students have been generating as part of that endeavor, which is really to kind of connect history as not this thing over there, but as a living sort of part of our work as designers and architects. So that's really the impetus of this, but also very happy to participate in this conversation today. So welcome, everybody.
Welcome, everyone. And I think it's my responsibility to introduce my friend and colleague, Claudette Brady from Harlem Now, who will take over and lead us. Okay, thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Claudette Brady. I am the Executive Director of Save Harlem Now. Save Harlem Now's mission is the preservation of Harlem's architectural and cultural heritage. It is my honor to introduce tonight's panel, starting with Jerome. As I can come up. Jerome is a licensed architect, a public artist, and an educator. He leads the award-winning Jerome Hayford Studios and serves as assistant professor at City College's Spitzer School of Architecture, where he co-directs the Spitzer Place, Memory, and Culture Incubator. A 2025 United States Artist Fellow, Hayford is also exhibiting in the U.S. Pavilion at the 19th Venison Architectural Biennale. His practice explores architecture and cultural infrastructure through the lens of marginalized histories, with projects ranging from the Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative to the National Black Theater. He's the lead architect for the Mellon Foundation's 2023 to 2024 Culture, Creative, and Care Initiative, and is designing a public artwork and plaza for the East River Esplanade. Peggy King-Jordy. Peggy is a pioneering preservationist, designer, filmmaker, and founder of King-Jordy Cultural Projects Consulting. Her work has redefined the preservation of African diaspora heritage sites around the world. In early 1990s, while serving as an architectural project manager for New York City's Office of Construction, she led the successful campaign to protect the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan, resulting in the designation as a national monument. As the director of the memorialization, she initiated national design competitions for both the African Burial Ground Memorial and the Interpretive Center. That achievement sparked her international work preserving sacred African diaspora sites, including projects in St. Eustatius. I was trying to get the Dutch pronunciation. St. Eustatius in the Dutch Caribbean and St. Helena Island in the South Atlantic, where she collaborated with the descendants to plan the memorialization of liberated African burial ground. She also served as producer of the documentary A Story of Bones, amplifying these often overlooked histories for global audiences. A Harvard Loeb Fellow and consulting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, King Jordy continues to advise design professionals, governments, and communities on ethical memorialization practices and the preservation of sites of memory and conscience. She is also the 2024 recipient of the New York State Preservation League's Pillar award that is given to individuals and organizations who have taken extraordinary steps in the protection, preservation, and promotion of New York's cultural and architectural heritage. Rodney Leon. Rodney Leon is the founder and principal of Rodney Leon Architect, PLLC, has an architectural background as a designer on a diversity of building types in the United States and abroad. Mr. Leon has made the design of sacred and cultural spaces of memory a primary focus of his professional career. Over the last 20 years, his architecture practice has developed an expertise in memorial design, cultural planning, and faith-based community development. He is an advocate of cultural, contextual, contemporary design that integrates the histories and cultures of diverse communities in the design process. Current memorial projects include Master Plan for the historic African American Mount Zion Cemetery in Washington, D.C., and the Enslaved African Memorial in Teaneck, New Jersey. Recent faith-based community development projects include the French Evangelical Presbyterian Church renovation and the expansion of the New York City and the BPHN senior housing development in Brooklyn. Currently, he's working on a 6,000 square foot museum exhibition space for the Cultural Museum of African Art in Brooklyn, New York. Mr. Leon is most widely known for being the designer of the African Burial Ground Memorial in New York City, which is the first national monument in the United States dedicated to the contributions of people of African descent. Mr. Leon is also the winner of the international competition by the United Nations to design the permanent memorial to the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Mr. Leon's winning entry entitled An Art of Return was unveiled at the United Nations Plaza by the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on March 25, 2015. Sarah Dean Pierre. Sarah Dean is the Senior Project Manager at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. She helps lead the engagement efforts to bring greater recognition and awareness of the Harlem African Burial Ground. Sharon Wilkins. Sharon Wilkins is a member of the Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative, a community group founded in 2009 to advocate for the construction of a memorial at the Harlem African Burial Ground. Since partnering with the New York City EDC in 2015. The initiative has determined a vision for the redevelopment project as part of the 2017 ULURP process, guide architectural work, and co-host community events. Ms. Wilkins is also the former Manhattan Borough Historian Emeritus and former president of the New York chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. Okay. Since we are in Jerome's house, the first question will go to you. And I think you've covered some of this in your introduction, but you can add some more if you wish. Tell us about the goals of the PMCI and specifically how the PMCI intends to memorialize the Harlem African Burial Ground and the work of the Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative.
Sure. You know, I think, can y'all hear me? Can y'all hear me? Yeah, now it's on. Well, when we conceived of this project, it really is in the kind of, I think, the confluence of those three words, place, memory, and culture, that we took seriously when thinking about future designers, in particular future designers of color, who really make up the population in the school. This is a school of architecture. And so the burial ground site was one of the sites very early on that was already kind of in the landscape of sites that seemed very critical to engage through this project, which also has a mission behind it to work with community members and other kinds of cultural actors. So when we did the studio course, we engaged you all, Save Harlem Now, and Caribbean Cultural Center, Africa Diaspora Institute, and even dancers, choreographers, Black memory workers, which is not something, that kind of combination in an architecture scholastic context is not that common. It's not very common to have, you know, two Black architects even in the same room. There's not that many of us.
We have three, I think.
Some high percentage of the, you know, the Black architects in New York, even in this room. So I felt, you know, also as somebody who lives on 127th Street, sort of well positioned to start with that site as one of the sites that we looked at with these young people. And there's a few of them in the room, if you want to raise your hands, who have worked up on this side of the wall that you all can take a look at what came out of that conversation. So again, I think really the anecdote that I was thinking about today in relationship to that site, but also the work in general of the PMCI, was something I heard actually in this room when I first started teaching here from the amazing Black landscape architect Walter Hood, when being asked about, you know, doing this kind of work, right? Doing the work of memorial, in particular with Black history or erased history. And he said, we don't really have a language to do this, and we're figuring this out. And I think by insisting that this is a kind of, that what we're doing is part of the cultural landscape, as architects, as designers, you begin to see that we have to work with other disciplines, other people in the community as a kind of united cultural field to do that. So that's a long-winded answer.
Thank you. Ms. Wilkins.
Yes.
The Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative has been a strong advocate for the preservation of this culturally significant site. Could you tell us about how this started and how you got to where you are today?
Oh, well, that's a long story, but I'll try to be brief. it started back in 2009 when the city was going to do work on the Harlem River and the bridge there. And when the archaeologists and the surveyors opened up the books, the city's books, New York City's books, and they found maps and they found surveying plans, they said, uh-oh, we have to stop construction right away. So they contacted the descendant church, which is the Elmendorf Reformed Church, now located on East 121st Street between Lexington and 3rd Avenues. That was the Elmendorf Reformed Church moved successively from Lower Manhattan up north, as the city began to urbanize and develop. So they contacted the church and they asked a question. Do you folks even know that there's a burial ground there? And of course the response was, oh yes we do. So the pastor reached out to several people, several professionals like myself. I happened to, at that point, be in the office. I had not yet achieved emeritus status. I was officially the Manhattan Deputy Borough Historian. And so we formed a group and have been working successfully ever since then. And a couple of things happened through our advocacy and intervention. One of the things was I went up to Albany at the appointed time to defend the project. And my defense was successful, and on the first vote, it was voted yes. So it was then listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We also worked with the city and MTA when it was evident that we had to shut down the facility as a bus depot. So I was part of the team that successfully negotiated for the decommissioning of the bus depot. And that was around, 2015, 2016, just before COVID set in. So all of that has been in the works. So since then, in the decommissioning, no buses are ever parked inside. There is knowledge that obviously when there is further work to construct the outdoor memorial and the indoor education and cultural center, that tanks and whatever have to be built. Now, the thing that will happen is that these two spaces, the outdoor memorial and the indoor education and cultural center, are part of a larger city complex that will include workforce development, commercial spaces, and residential properties, some low rent, et cetera. So we can't happen until the overall project happens, but negotiations continue, as you know, working through the political and fundraising process.
Thank you. Peggy King-Jordan, your work has been pivotal in preserving African diaspora heritage sites globally. What lessons from your experience with the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan can be applied to the Harlem African Burial Ground efforts?
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Well, you're right. I work on, ever since the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan, my career pivoted, and I now work on African burial grounds around the world. And when I say around the world, I'm talking about the South Atlantic, the island of St. Helena, St. Eustatius, other areas of the Caribbean, and throughout the United States. And there's one thing that I've come to learn about all of those places. When working on the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan, it was the first time I was up close and personal with archaeologists, right? And so what I learned from archaeologists was that they say that what in part defines us as human is how we bury our dead. Right? The cats don't dig a hole and bury the dead, dogs don't do that, cows don't do that. But what defines us in part as human is how we bury our dead. And so I started to think about all the sites that I was working on, and I would have people come to me and say, black and white people, say, why is it so important? we get it, but why is it so important? Well, if how we bury our dead is what in part defines us, right? And it makes us human. Imagine a community of people who live in a society that defines them as less than human, subhuman, in fact, right? That even on the laws of the books, the laws of this land, they say straight up, these people have no rights that anybody need respect, right? So then, on the occasion that a mother, a father, a sister, a brother dies, and only by permission of the oppressor, that a community is allowed, this community of subhumans is allowed to bury their dead, what you would be witnessing, in fact, is a community of people reclaiming their humanity, right? That's revolutionary. They would be engaging in an act of resistance, really. The oppressor doesn't realize it, but they're engaging in an act of resistance. And so burial ground sites for me are revolutionary sites. They are sites where revolutionary acts of remembrance took place. And in this country, there are national memorials to revolutionary battlegrounds. So why not? Why aren't we talking about African burial grounds as those places that have that kind of significance? So if there's anything that I would share, I mean, that is something that is in common. It is a place that it is a site that bore witness to us reclaiming our humanity, ancestors reclaiming their humanity. Just practically, the other things that I learned or I took from the African Burial Ground downtown was just some practical things. Leadership. Leadership on projects like this is important. How the community defines leadership, interpretation. Those who excavate in the ground, who go to the site, they excavate cultural resources, human remains. It matters who's doing that, and it matters who is in the lead. It also matters that those entities are listening to the community, that at all stages, whether it's archaeology, whether it's design, whether it's preservation, that the descendant community has a voice and is engaged in a meaningful way. So those are the most key places where I think that has to happen.
Sarah Dean, we know that the NYC EDC has been significantly involved in the preservation of the site. Can you tell us a little more about the overall project, the memorial, the housing development, the commercial development?
Yes, thank you. So as Sharon spoke to, yes, sorry, can you hear me? It's on, I think. All right, how's that? Okay, now I can hear myself now. So as Sharon mentioned, this is more than just the memorial. This is a full city block, and so there'll be different components to this site. So on the historic boundary of the Harlem African Burial Ground will be the outdoor memorial, and we wanted to design this so that there is no physical building on top of this sacred site. The site has been disturbed for far too long and desecrated, and so we wanted to make sure that there is still open space on the site to be a space to honor the people who have lived there, who are buried there, and also be a space for reflection for those in the Harlem neighborhood today. As mentioned, there's also going to be an indoor cultural education center, and so that'll be dedicated to celebrating the contributions of freed and enslaved Africans and also our indigenous peoples in this nation and within Harlem specifically. And this will also be a space to have community programming, some maybe museum installations, but will really be open to sort of who ends up being the operator of the center. On top of that, there is a mixed income housing project. So most of that will be affordable. Right now, we're estimating over 600 units, and 80% of that will be affordable. And then on top of that, there'll also be some commercial retail uses, hoping to get, local businesses to be involved to take up those spaces. And on top of the whole project, we also want this construction to help sort of improve the streetscape of the area, potentially add some greenery. We know this area is very much a heat island, and so we want to improve the overall landscape and make it more of a pedestrian-friendly space. And so this is the vision that we were able to come to back in 2016 and 2017 through the ULURP that we advocated for with the help of the initiative, as well as community members throughout Harlem. And so that's the vision of what we have for the site today.
Thank you. Rodney, what are some critical design objectives that the Harlem African Burial Ground project must meet in order to be successful in the areas of education, culture, spirituality, urban design, and accessibility?
Thank you. This is an opportunity, like every historic site that we discover, that especially in the north, in New York City, that starts to establish, I think, an idea that's grounded in the truth of history, as opposed to this kind of a fabrication of history that many of us have grown up to believe, such as slavery happened in the South, and it's primarily a Southern institution. The Lower Manhattan African Burial Ground was like the first to probably make that an awareness and understanding that the North, especially like New York City, had at one point, I think, the second largest slaveholding population in the United States. I didn't learn that in school coming up. So this, every time we discover a new burial ground, the Harlem African Burial Ground, the Flatbush African Burial Ground, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Flatbush African Burial Ground in Brooklyn. Peggy's also working on a burial ground in Inwood, in the Bronx. I lived in the Bronx briefly. I believe there's also a burial ground site in Van Cortlandt Park.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like these kind of secrets that we are afraid to engage in. We're afraid to engage in our history. We're afraid to tell the truth. And there's so much of a backlash that's going on right now that we're all aware of, because a lot of people, they want to maintain that historical fabrication. They want to maintain the status quo of history being suppressed, of us not being able to tell our stories. So, when we engage in these sites that are so sacred and so important, it's very important for us to, in the process, really engage broadly and establish a context of culture, a context of history, and a context of objectives that the community wants to express, because the people that were buried here didn't have the freedom or the opportunity to express themselves. And in a lot of ways, I feel that, these objectives that you outlined, like I think the objective of education is like a first and foremost, a primary objective, that whatever is created on the site needs to communicate and educate people about the history of the site in a truthful way, right? And it has to be grounded in historical context. It has to be grounded in cultural context. So much of what it is that we do and that we absorb is not necessarily an extension of our, for me, being a descendant, African cultural history or African culture itself. We express ourselves through contemporary language, most of us through English. Many of the people and most of the people are buried, let's say in the burial ground site in Lower Manhattan, were people that came directly from Africa. How do we really start to understand and engage that history and those cultures and express that reality? Because we're given an opportunity to now tell a story and tell a history and to undo a lot of the anonymity, a lot of the erasure, that people like to use that term now, erasure, of history. How do we begin to create a space that starts to communicate, educate, and tell a story? I see a lot of times a memorial is an opportunity. It kind of bridges the gap between architecture and art and create a kind of like a spiritual landscape where people can explore and engage. And that spiritual landscape, that cultural landscape, can start to tell that story in a way that it has been kind of hidden for such a very long time. So, those objectives, I think, have to be grounded in history, they have to be grounded in culture. And there's, following up with what Sarah Dean was talking about in terms of the urban environment, of how to transform the urban environment. Memorials and our urban environment are not only, spaces and places of interaction, they're also, they extend beyond our lifetime. So it's really about, as societies, we are leaving behind a legacy of who it is that we are, what it is that we value, and for so long, we haven't been given an opportunity to show the value of the people of African descent in this country that were enslaved, right? And I think that, this is like a very critical piece for us. So in terms of like the urban context itself, there's a lot of often contradictory and complex things that we have to deal with. You have to deal with the fact of, you need a public space, right, where large people can come together and gather. But you also need to, at the same time, provide places of reflection and individual personal experience, right? You need also places and spaces that allow people to come together and to communicate and educate, whether it's like a school group or whether it's like, tour guides coming through with other tour groups. So how do you balance the spiritual and sacred nature of this space, but at the same time, create a public space for celebration? Because at the end of the day, many memorials are about tragic histories, but for me, it's about how do we also expand beyond that tragic history and then start to heal this process. It's an opportunity to create a space of healing. So I hope I answered your question well.
Thank you. Sharon. And our next set of questions will center around community and how we engage the community about this, about the Harlem African Burial Ground. And so for Sharon, I want to ask you, how has your partnership with EDC helped you? How has it helped you to get this education out to the broader community?
Well, there are several things that I can say. One of the things is that engaging the consultants, Bridge Philanthropies, we opened an internal dialogue about having these kinds of forums in a variety of settings. So there have been senior centers, youth programs, education programs, here at the School of Architecture, so that we can engage, inform, but also hear your voices in terms of what you know about this history. One of the things as a historian that I have made it eminently clear, initially when we started talking about the space that the Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative will house, everyone said a cultural center. And I said, no, it is an education and cultural center, because we need to reclaim, recapture that history. There's so many documents, there are oral histories, there's immense scholarship that researchers and faculty people at colleges have done, and all of us personally who've been engaged. So we are eminently concerned about that. And given the fact, as many of you may know, that Black studies, Black history is no longer permitted in 30 states and counting across this nation, that cannot continue. So this will be a space where we can engage, we can teach, we can learn, and we can collaborate. So it will be a space where conferences can be held, where forums can be held. And if I, usually I do a whole presentation, which we don't have time for tonight, but this Harlem African Burial Ground was in force for 2 centuries, from the 17th to the 19th century. In the mid-1800s, approximately 1863 or so, when the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx was inaugurated, there were 2 cemeteries there, actually. The cemetery for the internment of Europeans was known as God's Acre. The cemetery for the internment of African-descended people was known as the Negro or Harlem African Burial Ground. Woodlawn approached the descendants of Europeans to ask, with the establishment of the cemetery, if they would wish to have their ancestor remains disinterred and reinterred in Woodlawn. No such accommodation was in any way offered to the African descendants. So, you know, there's centuries of dislocation, disrespect, dishonoring, erasure, etc. So, you know, when I joined this initiative, I made it very clear that this was going to be professionally based, it was going to be educationally based, and we were going to tell our truths. So make no, you know, we tell our truth, we tell our truth.
Okay. This next question is for both Rodney and Sadiq. And I'll ask the question and then give you the perspective from which I would like you to answer it. EDC defines the descendant community as lineal descendants, members of descendant institutions, as people who self-identify as descendants, for example, church congregation members, and people who are part of the African diaspora, whose ancestors were victims of the transatlantic slave trade. So with that being said, Rodney, from your perspective as a person of Haitian immigrants, how would you engage the non-American born community who are descendants based on this definition and who could be DNA descendants for all we know, as part of the enslavement process was to separate families. So for all we know, your great-great-grandmother was the sister of someone who arrived on the shores of North America. So how do we engage other people, especially Afro-Caribbeans, Afro-Latinos, to feel themselves as part of this descendant community?
Wow, that's a powerful question. And that's a question for like every project, because I would say like personally, like in terms of like memorial designs that relate back to African descendant sites, for me it's that process of self-discovery in a lot of ways, and I would imagine to a degree for there's a process of not only memorialization and historical recognition, but there's a process of also self-discovery, trying to understand where one came from, right? Very similar to like now we have the 23andMe and all these other types of DNA analysis, and people are now beginning to rediscover who they are, not only in terms of like their current culture, but their historical ancestry. I think there's something in the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan we designed. It's called the Circle of the Diaspora, and that aspect of the design is reflective of what the question is talking about in terms of this African cultural heritage was dispersed throughout mostly the Western Hemisphere, North America, South America, Central America, Europe, but our culture retained certain kind of common elements. And nevertheless also kind of transformed, showing the resilience of the diaspora of African people. And the goal, I think, in a lot of ways is how does one bring back that unity without conformity? Within the process of doing that, we are very fortunate to be in the most diverse city in the world and having so many cultural resources throughout the city and different groups of people from different diasporas actually coming back to one space to begin to kind of reclaim that African ancestral heritage. So I think that this would be like a big part of, let's say, a community engagement process where we can begin to reach out to different cultural groups and ethnic groups throughout the city and have that dialogue and have that discussion. It'll be a lot less difficult here in New York City than it would be out, let's say, in the Midwest or the South or something like that, right? Because, I coming from, my parents both being born in Haiti, have the benefit of actually learning about my ancestral heritage through the lens of a Haitian experience. Many other people have that through the lens of a different Caribbean cultural background. I believe yours from Jamaica, others from African American cultural experience, others directly from Africa, and others, I think there's also the opportunity of the fact that, we're kind of like not one individual type of people, but we're all mixed. And through African ancestry, there's many people that can claim both European ancestry, African ancestry, Native American ancestry. So I think that there should be integrated into the design some type of a genealogical center. I don't know if Sharon has that part in the program. But
Oh, yes.
I would definitely advocate for a genealogical center so that people have an opportunity, regardless of how, one might perceive of them visually or culturally, to claim our collective history, And that's another aspect of the design process also that we need to kind of like acknowledge.
I'll partner with my colleague here and say that when I do presentations, one of the things that I allow people to express is however you self-identify, we are one humanity. So whether it's Afro-Indigenous, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-European, Afro-Latino, Black, African, whatever it is, we are one collective human kind. And starting from Africa, before we were taken from the continent, what many people don't realize, because we don't teach it effectively, is that people on the continent represent a whole host, as Rodney was saying, of ethnicities, a whole host of languages. They had culture, they had spirituality, they had familial ties. So we bring that experience with us. And they also had tremendous skills, just to name a few. Agriculture, mining, metalworking, ironworking, and all of these things came out of Mother Africa. So all of this is part of our thought process in terms of designing an education and cultural center, which will have an archives and library. So we'll be able to do that kinds of things you're talking about.
Can I add to that
Go ahead.
conversation?
Yes.
What I like to say is, because I do work on these sites elsewhere, this story, the context, is the transatlantic slave trade. And that is a story that is not bound by landmass or anybody's country line or anything. Wherever that story is, that's the story we're trying to recapture and tell. Now, there are other things culturally that are rich about our communities, no matter where they come from. But when you talk about the Caribbean island, you're talking about the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes.
When you're talking about the Dominican Republic, you're talking about the transatlantic slave trade. All of that, Brazil, all of those places, that is the connector.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an important story to tell because it's been fragmented. And everything that we do relative to the burial grounds is just a reminder of where, in an era or a time where folks were buried there, either during that time or whatever the wave was after that time, whether it was Reconstruction or whatever. We are in a movement of recovering sites that matter to our community and the diasporic community. And the story, unless we tell that story, and I mean globally, I'm working with the Kingdom of the Netherlands because they have made their apology and they are dealing with members of the community. Until we tell that story completely and connect all of those things of what happened, we learn from all of those communities. What happened? You know, we will not have done our job. It is a movement, and that's why the broader community has to help tell that story.
And do you want to add?
No, I was just gonna, it's been mentioned, but including at the Inwood site, we also, anywhere in this continent, but particularly in New York, are engaging Native history too. There's
Oh, yes.
There's Native, you mentioned this. So it really, even that is part of the story as well.
Yep.
It has to be.
Okay. Sarah Dean.
Yeah, I mean, echoing what everyone else said, and I guess what it made me reflect on is actually through the engagement work that we've been doing with Bridge Philanthropic Consulting and the initiative. We've been doing these family history workshops at senior centers and NYC campuses around Harlem. And during one of the activities, we have people just draw a simple family tree. You know, an activity on paper that seems simple, but it actually gives people really time to reflect on their bloodline, but also who they consider family, even if it's not, you know, through, you know, blood or biology. Exactly. And it was through that activity that a lot of folks felt really compelled to tell their story and share about how they came to New York, how they made community through here. And one woman stood up and she only spoke in Spanish, and through that activity, it made her reflect on just how we as people are interconnected, and how, in terms of the Mexican Revolution, a lot of leaders were mixed, were African and Mexican and indigenous descent. And so through that process, you realize just the connection of how, as a people, even though, as Rodney mentioned, it has been, you know, dispersed, that we are able to connect through these, you know, these sites and these really sacred spaces. So I thought, you know, I think it's really important that we are, engaging sort of different groups across Harlem, but also throughout the city, so that people can sort of have that self-discovery process.
I might just add one thing. We're fortunate in our collaboration with New York City Economic Development Corporation to have emphasized that we have Black professionals. So the bioanthropologist, the bioarchaeologist, the person who does forensic work is of African descent. So there is a real commitment to making sure that we uncover and we recapture all of the information that we can. We're also connecting with the second phase of archaeology has revealed indigenous remains. So we're also making sure that we respectfully connect with the indigenous community. So all of the things that you might think about, we are thinking about and have thought about.
And another one to Sardine, because you brought up the archaeological process. Could you delve a little bit more into where we are in that process? What is being done with the remains that have been excavated to date, and how will those remains be housed once the excavation has been completed?
Great, thank you. Yeah, so right now, EDC, we've hired an archaeology consultant to do work on the burial ground site. There was work done back in 2015 where they dug portions of the site, really small test trenches. But this phase is different in that we're discovering the full extent of human remains on the site. So right now that investigation is ongoing. And as Sharon mentioned, we're consulting with indigenous tribes local to the New York City area to understand the ways they want their remains to be stored, honored, and respected. And so that work is ongoing. With the remains that were found within the historic boundary of the Harlem African Burial Ground, that is being stored through our consultant, AKRF. They have their own lab on the site, and the idea is that once we begin construction for the future memorial and indoor cultural education center, those remains will be stored at the New York City Archaeological Repository, and that's where the remains from 2015 are. It's a very respectful place. It's very much an environment that's very controlled. It's climate safe. We want to make sure that the sites aren't further deteriorated, and so that is where those remains will stay until they can be reinterred as a part of the future memorial.
Thank you. excuse me, for Peggy. What are, and I think you've covered this before, what are the essential elements of an ethical memorial? Do we engage community? Do we look at religion? How do we ethically memorialize people who we may not know their histories or backgrounds?
Right. I think that's it, and you're right. It's really about reaching out and engaging the community, the descendant community, in a meaningful way, right? I was working on a project. I'd been contacted by a couple, a guy who's a descendant of a slave owner, and he has land, acres and acres of land in Virginia, and he contacted me. He lives in California, and he contacted me and said, I'm trying to donate as a part of repair some of my land to the local community. But he hadn't gotten a great response and asked if he and his wife could bring me down to meet with the community to talk about the site, to walk the site, to see what he thought was historically important and all of that. And one of the things that came out in our conversation was that when I met with members of the community, we were on the land, in trees. This was clearly a working plantation, right? The remnants of the main house were there. It was just sort of the foundation, and that was held by a historical society that really refused to tell the story. So this was a gentleman who, because his father or his grandfather had given that to the local historical society. So this was a strip of land along the waterfront where enslaved oystermen used to work, right? And he wanted to donate this strip of land because there was an area where enslaved Africans were disembarked and sold from that plantation. And so he thought that would have significance to the community. And when I met with members of the community, we were sitting on this land overlooking the water. And when I asked the community, what is it, why are you resistant? What is your hesitation for taking this land? And the first thing was, well, we know what the white folks are going to say. And they felt that they were going to encounter resistance on the part of the community. And then they said, well, we also don't know how we're going to raise money to build a memorial or to build an interpretive center, and we don't know how we're going to do that. How are we going to take care of this land? And here we were sitting in little lawn chairs in the pine, beautiful, overlooking. And I said to them, memorialization is not defined by statues or architecture. Memorialization is defined by how people want to occupy a place, right? And so I said, look at us. We are sitting in seats below the pines, overlooking a beautiful scene of water, when we know that the ancestors who were once here were at work. They were not at rest like we are. They were at work. They were toiling on the land. And here you are, descendants in the area, at rest, occupying this space. So even if you take that land and the community defines it as a place, at least for now, as a place that you're going to come and do your picnic or your Juneteenth or your pouring of libations, your bodies occupy a place. What you do there defines its meaning, and that will carry on for generations. Now, if down the line you all get some money and you want to put a sign up or you want to put a building up, that's all right too. But really, the significance is about how community defines how they want to bear witness to what happened there and what the meaning of that space is all about. So ethically, yes.
I'm gonna have one last question for Sarah Dean, and then we're gonna take some audience. Ms. Wilkins, did you want to say something? I see you.
No.
And then we are gonna take some audience questions, but I'm gonna ask the question that I think everybody in the audience would like to know. How can the community stay connected to this project once they leave this room?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So we have been sharing project updates and other events like this through our Instagram. It's at Harlem African Burial Ground, all one word. So we invite you all to follow us to keep track on the progress of the archaeology work, but also the broader vision of when the Indoor Cultural Education Center, as well as the memorial, will eventually be constructed. We also have a newsletter that goes out quarterly where we share a bit more details about the project team, recaps of events, and also updates on the future opportunities for getting involved in terms of the Indoor Cultural Center. If you're interested, nonprofit, we really invite anyone, especially within the Harlem community, to apply to that opportunity. So we'll be sharing that out through our email and our newsletter. So that is all within the one-pagers and also the flyers that we passed out when you walked in here. So yeah, just keeping us updated through social media, and we'll also be having events throughout Harlem way into the summer as well. So we invite you all just to stay connected with us in social media and in person. And also just thank you all for coming. I think through events like these, we're able to spread the word and just share more of this story that more folks need to learn, and share with folks who aren't here as well. We really want to make sure we get the word out and that the community is engaged throughout the next phases of the project.
So if you have a question, these two ladies will come around and pick them up. There's a gentleman over here, and I'm going to start with what I have. And the first one is, please name the other burial grounds in New York City where folks can learn more about these sites. So, the other burial grounds, do we have a centralized?
No, there's nothing centralized. In fact, I was contacted by the City of New York's Parks Department because they are looking to try and develop a policy for how to handle these sites, because on public land there are many of these sites. And then there's no one place to learn about these sites, and that's, hopefully we'll get to a place where we can do that. I mean, I personally have worked on the Van Cortlandt African Burial Ground, as well as the Inwood African Burial Ground in northern Manhattan, and very early on, the one in Brooklyn, but just kind of listening and sharing whatever insights I had.
Flatbush.
Yeah.
Flatbush.
Yes.
Yeah.
Flatbush,
Two
yeah.
in Queens, one on
Sankofa.
Dunkin' Donuts, I just found out about. But that's a whole other story. How do you manage competing claims from the descendant community? So I'm not quite sure.
When you say competing claims,
Yes.
like what claims? Because it
Yeah,
depends
so,
on.
Hi, my question. I've been working with Flatbush African Burial Ground on some other burial grounds, and often in the distinct community, there are people who want very different things.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how you sort of approach, like, what voice, how do you approach managing different voices, how do you approach who sort of gets final say in what's going to happen?
Some of it is, I think, first of all, it's a good thing to have all those voices. The same thing happened with the African Burial Ground downtown. There were some people who believed and said, we don't want a memorial at all. We just want the sun and the moon and the stars above that ground. But then there were more voices that were about, well, no, we need to see something in the landscape. We need to occupy space, even when we're not there. And so it's hard to, I would say it's hard to just, no one person makes that decision. I think what happens is it's almost just sort of by default, certain things start to take place. There's reburial, there you know, people doing part of this outreach, getting community to weigh in, larger community, you know, a larger body of community members. I, for example, for the African Burial Ground, I used to put surveys out and ask people how would they like to experience going to that site. And that was an opportunity to say, I don't want to see anything. I just want to, you know, I want to see grass. And I just want to go there to lay something. So it somehow it sort of works its way out, and I think just practically and by default, just how things end up working out. Where are you on that project? Just by the way, where do you work on the project?
I'm one of the trustees for the Coalition of
Okay. Okay.
I have Roberta Washington in the audience. Roberta, do you have a question?
Well, yes, just related to how you resolve the question of different people's opinions and different professionals' opinions about how the images, how the history is reflected. Working on that African Burial Ground downtown.
Roberta, could you give us a little context?
So we were the architect for the what is probably more looked at as a museum, but the part where you learn about what happened. Rodney did a fantastic job of showing the main exhibition space outside in terms of a memorial that you can walk around and touch and all of that. But then there was a need to have a place where you could get further information, right? And you could have more details, and you could learn, and you could see there are murals, and this is where there are pamphlets and there are books and things to also talk about it. But there were different kinds of views of how you projected what life was at a particular time and who the people were. And one of the main arguments, or not arguments, let's just say discussions, was about various people's opinions of how the Africans should be portrayed. Right? And so there were some people on the professional team who thought that because we don't really know what these people look like, how can we project and have like photographs of them, or how can we have a model? How can we make models? We don't know what those people look like, which is true. But then, especially Black folks wanted to see a real something, because our consultants were saying, well, we can have like this thing of glass, I think it was like 2 or 3 inches of this glass thing, and we can, have it shaped like whatever, and put some clothing of a particular type on African clothing. But other folks were saying, no, they won't look like they're supposed to look. We need to have like real models, even if we don't know what they really look like.
Okay.
We need to have something that we can relate to as our ancestors.
Yeah.
And that was a long battle, and of course, well, if you've ever seen the end result, it was, there are models. When you look, there's a child, and there are people who look, no, we don't know exactly what they look like, but I think having something that is more in the realm of realism works best for folks. But I think those are the discussions that you can't solve it on a day.
No, you can't, and that's an important. There's something that you said, which is we're developing a language. Whether it's in an interpretive center, whether it's design, we're still developing a language. And the question that you raise is an important one, because that is something that I learned very early on when the excavation was happening at the African Burial Ground, and the archaeologists were on site, you had community members saying, no, take your hands off our ancestors' bones, cover them up, rebury them. We don't want anything else done to them. But I tell you, when I would go and speak with community, and I would be in meetings like this, people would invariably come up to me and say, are we going to see the bones in the interpretive center? And I go, no, we're not going to see that. But what that said to me was, because again, this is all still, we're still in the early phases of recovering our sites, right? So what it said to me, though, is that the community is saying, we are starved for seeing us, our history, who we were, and we need to see representation, at least for now. And for those of us who worked on the interpretive center, when I worked with some of the interpretation team, the archaeologists and historians, we were at a history conference a couple of months ago in New Jersey. And when we talked about the fact that that interpretive center has so much, far too much information in it, way too much for a place like that. But what was critical was that we put as much as we could possibly put, because that was our one window of opportunity. So for the moment, it's a challenge. But it is one that I think as we continue to repeat it, we hone our skills and language around interpretation and who we are, and the community starts to feel like we're seeing ourselves in different ways being interpreted within our communities. That's all going to sort of transform and become a bit easier.
So have all kinds of evidence of those Africans in European art. So that is not just a blank canvas you're pulling from. There have been representations of those Africans from that time period. So it was not that difficult to tease out something that could have been representative. And we need to not say you can't find those images. You can find those images. Those images are there. A hard search, but not that difficult to find.
And it's an international effort.
Okay, thank you so much. And we are going to move on. I'm going to move on with some more audience questions. These two are specifically for EDC. What is the timing of the overall mixed-use project?
Yeah, so with the mixed-use project, it is hard to say since archaeology work is ongoing, and it's been taking a lot longer than anticipated because of us, with the discovery of these indigenous remains and the ongoing consultation that we're doing. But right now, the phase that we are in is that we are hoping to release an RFP for someone to host and operate the Indoor Cultural Education Center. And following that, we'll release a developer RFP for the mixed-use site. So we're hoping that that RFP will be released sometime 2027, 2028. And, that's all dependent on, securing funding, making sure we get the right developer. But that's sort of the overall timeline that we're hoping for right now.
And then this one, clarify the desire for retail as part of the site types and sizes. And I think that cannot be answered now, or yes?
No, yeah, so that is just something that was included in the rezoning, so it kept it open in terms of the uses that could be on the site. It doesn't have to be retail. It's not something that we have to follow to a T, but that was something that was expressed through the East Harlem rezoning back in 2015 and 2016, that people were looking for more retail options that were owned by people from the neighborhood.
So there's a commercial overlay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Is there a design for the memorial?
Not yet. So that's actually something we are looking to, we're looking to begin that process through this RFP for the Cultural Education Center. We're looking for a nonprofit to help lead that process and collaborate with an artist. So that hasn't started yet, but we're very inspired by, these conversations and having, advisors like Rodney Leon and hearing from Peggy, like, these are things we want to replicate and want to make sure that, you know, folks like you and other people in Harlem are also included as part of the process. And so once that operator is selected, they're also going to be doing ongoing engagement surrounding the design specifically.
And here's a question which I think we sort of talked about but never actually specifically identified. Where exactly is the Harlem African?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So it is in East Harlem, so way East Harlem off 126th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenues. I'm trying to think of other landmarks. If you know the Crack is Whack playground, it's not too far from there. So right by the water and by it's the bus depot, but it's the former bus depot, but it's the Harlem African Burial Ground.
Everybody remember the old bus depot on 126th Street? That's sitting on top of the burial ground. And that's exactly where it is. It stands towards the river. I mean, I'm sorry to gorilla your meeting, but I walked that side of Sciame with a ground penetrating radar gentleman before 2015. And we found enough evidence to realize that we need to be digging here. And so that's how we got the impetus to make sure that got done properly. Because we got somebody to come in, walked it with the thing.
Ground penetrating radar.
Something's here. And so that's basically the impetus for making sure there was a real excavation to prove the bodies were there.
And the other thing that's not immediately evident is that was the water's edge.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a big part of the story.
Oh, yeah.
You walk over there and you don't realize that was where the water.
The old maps actually show.
Map show that.
Right.
Okay, so here's another question, and I think based on history, we probably know the answer to this one. Do the findings confirm that our ancestors did the burying? As in, we buried ourselves?
I think we did.
I would,
Yeah.
yeah, I would say yes.
That's okay. It was said that the church definitively knew the site was a burial ground. Do they have documentation of the names of the individuals, and have they connected those people with families? And
We found, I believe, we're fortunate to have found approximately 30-something names. And in a few cases, there has been a connection to the descendant family.
It's pretty special.
That's an unusual occurrence, but
okay. How will the remains be studied? What will happen? Will they be reinterred? Will there be DNA extracted and put on 23andMe?
Okay, in the African tradition, the remains are normally reinterred. However, because this site is, as Professor Herford just said, near the Harlem River, because our environment is vastly changing and has changed, their water conditions, because it was a bus depot, there are oil tanks, and there are all kinds of things that, some of which we know and some of which we do not know yet. Okay. To the extent possible, preservation efforts will occur. One of the things that's under discussion now is not only with the initiative, but also with the indigenous community, how do we study? What further do we study? What do we know? Or what don't we know? And that's the reason why the scientific community is involved. I mentioned, bioarchaeologists, bioanthropologists. We're under discussion now, especially with the indigenous community, but ourselves, in terms of, how much forensic investigation do we really, is it applicable to take or do we want to take? Because part of that may mean disturbing those disarticulated remains and breaking them apart to some extent, depending upon the level of study. So these are all discussions that are underway, and we will have to make, some determinations at a future date. But that's, it's a complicated process, not only, from a historical perspective, from a spiritual perspective, but from a scientific perspective as well.
But I was wondering is there an institution gonna be selected to conduct this study like in Lower Manhattan? The bones went to Howard University, and the study was conducted there. How's it gonna happen here?
We're working through that process. As Sarah Dean mentioned, the archaeological firm, which is a very good firm, AKRF, is driving the science right now, but we aren't at that stage yet. So that's to be determined.
Oh, let me just clarify, Dr. Rachel Watkins is part of the team, right?
Yeah.
And I had Dr. Watkins as part of the Inwood African Burial Ground. And she worked on the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan. She was at Howard University. So she's very, very well aware. We also, when we spoke to the community for the Inwood project, we made it very clear that, we didn't think that there was any interest if we found any remains that anybody was going to want to do any DNA studies or things like that. But certainly when it was presented in such a way that the community was very integral as a part of that conversation. Remember at the top of this I said, leadership is everything. And that's what we've learned on this kind of project. So I think that with Dr. Rachel Watkins, I don't know all the ins and outs of that project, but I would have confidence that she would be very clear about the kind of input that the community would need to have.
And I'm going to do two more questions. This one is for EDC, and this one's just going to be simple. Maybe I'll have time for another. Has the MTA been approached to give funds since they are the former occupants of the site?
Been approached to receive funds?
No, to give funds, to fund the project.
That's a good question. I don't think they have actually provided funds for this project. This has been funded through just the general city capital budget that's approved by the mayor. I think this is something that EDC has really been managing along with the initiative. I think once MTA sort of recognized the news, they kind of wanted to wipe their hands clean from it, and so they transferred the land for EDC to manage.
Okay.
That was my second question. Once you get to where you are, the first question is, this is supposed to be an archival center. Everybody's touched on it. Everybody in the panel has touched on it. But the key phrase for me is archival, because beyond education, we need to be able to access who we are as a people, and there need to be a center for folks to be able to access that. And the way things are going in Washington, and the way things are going some parts of the rest of the country, we need to be building our own archival center where our stuff is curated, climate control, the whole bit. I know Sharon's working on that, but this needs to be publicly in the mix, because when you build, you have to build climate control from the ground up. You can't go back and retrofit.
No, you can't.
So that's why that's out there now publicly. And secondly, funding about MTA. You get this built, you get the bill right. Who's going to fund it? How's it going to maintain? How's it going to operate? Are we doing long-term planning for down the road? That's my key question about this.
So yes, there is funding dedicated to this project. That's not related to the MTA, but right now there's over 30 million dedicated to this project, and so that includes the archaeology, the eventual construction of the memorial and the indoor cultural center. And the idea is that once the housing is created, that'll also help to sustain the funds to maintain the operation.
Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. Part of the operating housing funding for people living there, money coming in, is going to be allocated to keep this center running.
Yes.
Sounds like a good plan to me.
All right, so question on that, last question on that. So based on that question, is the assumption that the city will be the owner of this housing complex, the entire complex, or will it, and will be managing it?
Not exactly. So it would be more of a lease situation. So the city would work with a developer, which is, organizations that work on building out these projects, and the developer would manage the actual construction and the day-to-day operations. So it would be in partnership with the city, but the developer would really take charge in that aspect.
Public-private partnership?
Exactly.
Okay,
Burial ground site will be the outdoor memorial. There won't be a building on top of the memorial. It's a large site, it's a full city block, so there's a portion of the site that wasn't associated with the burial ground. There wasn't anything there. That's where the housing and commercial space will be.
The second phase of archaeology, which is ongoing, and will be ongoing for the next several months probably, indigenous remains have been identified. Both the federal government and New York State have identified and certified certain indigenous groups that are to represent the indigenous community. Several meetings have been held. Meetings will continue to be held, and there's a lot of outreach to the indigenous community. We want to be very respectful and very cognizant of indigenous history, indigenous culture, indigenous spirituality. The two have to be blended and mixed, and we're very much aware of that and working in that context.
thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Sylvia.
I'd like to thank our panelists, EDC, Bridge Philanthropic, and all of you.